History often likes to portray the 13 colonies as a place that always had a burgeoning spirit of independence, or perhaps as a place that exercised valiant lengths of freedom in the way they seemingly managed their affairs separately from Britain. Yet, in many cases throughout the history of these colonies, this much was not the case. Specifically in terms of economics, the financial infrastructure of these colonies often revealed the story of profound dependency on the British crown. In a developing frontier devoid of a sufficient number of coin, the necessity for a functional medium of exchange coerced the adoption of more localized and makeshift monetary systems, most popularly in the form of tobacco commodity money and provincially issued bills of credit. However, rather than fostering a greater degree of autonomy, the utilization of both tobacco commodity money and colony issued bills of credit in pre independence colonial America effectively bound the colonial economies more to the British economy by increasing the demand for the British pound through various problems. As they both possess vulnerability to extreme fluctuations in price and value, the two of them were a primitive form of money that struggled to garner reputability, and they were both largely unable to be used for intercolonial trade. The 13 colonies in this pre-independence era were plagued by a tremendous problem that effectively set up the need for these forms of alternative money systems, with that problem being that the colonies simply did not have enough of the British pound in circulation. As more English settlers began to uproot their lives and move across the world to this new frontier, they were largely unable to take with them as many of their possessions as they wished, which often included considerable amounts of their British money. Many settlers were left with no choice but to take the bare necessities with them along their lengthy journeys across the sea, and in the much earlier stages of the colonies especially, the British pound did not have much of a use in the underdeveloped colonies anyway. Even further, the 13 colonies did not produce their own specie, gold and silver, and received most of it from Spanish America, and if they did have the appropriate metals to produce their own money, they were unable to mint their own currency in the colonies due to legislation after 1688. These problems altogether created a great shortage of the British coin in colonial America. With this lack of British coin, the colonists resorted originally to barter systems for most of their domestic and economic endeavors, or in other words, exchanging one good for another without the use of regulated money. This system was advantageous and appealing in the beginning, as it allowed them to save their British coin, in which they lacked, for trade with Britain and other international trades. This system also appeared to be quite necessary for the survival of these colonists, as it did not merely stem from the fact that they were short in circulation of coin, but also because the native peoples proved to be an incredibly vital partner in trade for the colonists, and those native peoples were not very accepting of coin. Yet, while seemingly being a functional system for these reasons, this system of bartering had numerous problems. It did not provide a concrete solution to the lack of coin. For instance, bartering was immensely less efficient and was much more costly than regular money-based commerce, and overall, it took much more energy to conduct. In a bartering system, to make a trade, you would have to find someone with your exact needs while simultaneously having that person want exactly what you have. Overall, the quantity of transactions was henceforth reduced, and thereby restricted much of the economic growth in colonial America. Because of these failures of the bartering system, it created a dire need for a new system that could address the shortage of British money, but also resolve the faults that the barter system had. The apparent solutions that came about for these colonists were both tobacco commodity money and paper bills of credit. Tobacco commodity money and colonial issued bills of credit were adopted because they seemed, at least at face value, to provide many productive ways to solve the shortage of British money, as well as the shortcomings of the barter system. However, while they were functionally aligned in their pursuit of monetary stability, they were still bifurcated by a variety of practical disparities, and it is important to define and understand exactly what they were and how they functioned. Tobacco commodity money is as the name suggests, and was a system of money where tobacco, which was a commodity item, was used and exchanged as a form of currency. One of the primary reasons that tobacco commodity money found its way into such prevalence in America was because the demand for it in Europe was astronomically high, as Europeans enjoyed smoking on this new substance that was otherwise unobtainable without importing it from the colonies. With this incredible demand for tobacco overseas in Europe, it helped cut back on expenses made with British coin because they could start to make more of their trades with Europe by exchanging only tobacco. Tobacco money also seemed to bypass the limitations of the traditional barter system typically used by native populations, as the demand for tobacco from indigenous peoples was also especially high. Aside from the fact that the product of tobacco is addictive in nature, native people often had tobacco intertwined into their cultures and viewed it as a material that possessed healing properties as well as having traditional importances, which facilitated a great willingness to trade for tobacco among natives. That much can be seen in this quote from Melanie Nadeau's article titled Circles of Tobacco Wisdom. Quote, traditional or ceremonial tobacco use occurs in a variety of forms. Tobacco can be offered to the creator or as a gift when honoring someone. It may be placed on the ground or burned in a pipe, dish, shell, or fire, with the smoke believed to carry prayers to the creator. Tobacco also had many uses in traditional Indian medicine and healing. Tobacco money also took the form of paper currency called warehouse receipts, where government-backed tobacco warehouses could generate receipts that were backed 100% by their actual tobacco inventory. These were then circulated in the colonial economies and were able to be used as a substitute for conventional British money and held genuine monetary value. This system was intended to streamline the exchange of value in tobacco, bypassing the logistical challenges of transporting a bulky physical crop. Bills of credit in colonial America were an innovative form of money that had a unique and interesting way of functioning, designed specifically to alleviate the chronic shortage of the British currency. These bills of credit were first introduced in the 1690s and were a pioneering system of currency that were the first ever form of paper money in America. And unlike regular money, these bills were backed in value by the promise of future tax revenue or loan repayments collected over several years. While this may seem complicated, the simple fact that they were paper notes backed by value tied directly to that of British pounds made them an incredibly popular way of making transactions, paying off debts, or paying government expenses. On top of this, they were portable, officially sanctioned, already familiar to those who used them due to the value being tied to British pounds, and easily divisible. Consequently, the barter system was able to be largely replaced by these bills of credit in tandem with tobacco money. By providing such a legitimate and popular alternative, bills of credit offered a solution to bridge the liquidity gap left by the chronic shortage of British coinage. They were able to facilitate daily transactions in a way that was very similar to how British money could. And because the barter system had been a desperate response to the lack of coin, the introduction of a seemingly reliable paper medium that was much alike in functionality to the British pound allowed it to be systematically phased out. Yet, while these bills resolved the immediate crisis of exchange, they, along with tobacco money, simultaneously tethered the colonial economy to a new set of volatile fiscal dependencies. One glaring difficulty with tobacco money and bills of credit was that these forms of commerce suffered from an incredible amount of instability and loss of value. Because of this, these systems of money became harder to use as a reliable system, which forced a shift in which the colonies were driven into deeper dependence on the British economy by increasing the demand for the British pound. Beginning with tobacco money, the currency was notoriously unstable because it was a physical commodity prone to decay. Storing tobacco in warehouses indeed increased longevity but did not make it immune to rotting, and if these inventories of tobacco were not traded or used quick enough, it would begin to lose its value as it sat and spoiled. This made tobacco money exceptionally unstable, as someone who relied on tobacco to make purchases could lose a tremendous amount of their monetary value if their tobacco happened to wither. This risk was only heightened by the colony's early infrastructure, where unreliable transportation, along with unexpected delays, frequently stranded harvests in the field, leaving owners with no choice but to watch their capital literally rot away. The reality that tobacco was a plant also directly leads to its volatility in price, as the unique intricacies and functions behind its cultivation had many impacts on its value. Events as simple as weather could greatly affect the productivity of tobacco farmers, and the smaller, or bigger, yields from year to year would directly influence the price of tobacco annually. In addition to this, higher demand for tobacco tended to result in overplanting by farmers, driving prices down while simultaneously having occasional price booms from an incredible array of external factors. In short, tobacco money was profoundly unstable in its price, as well as remarkably prone to physical depreciation that made it difficult to work with. As for bills of credit, they too were prone to depreciation and wild variations in value. The fact that these bills of credit were the first ever paper bills in America and were such an early attempt at paper money left many problems afoot. These bills were often printed on rag paper, and without modern precision tools, many bills were printed particularly thin and had a reputation for being susceptible to wear and tear. Even further, these issues were compounded by the nature of the bills themselves. Because they were backed by future tax revenues or loan repayments, several problems arose, such as the fact that interest was often not supplied to those who held the bills, or also because the sum of the bills issued sometimes exceeded the sum of the taxes paid in the colony each year. Because of these issues, bills of credit became unpredictable through not only their physical abilities of deterioration, but also because there were valid worries that their values might not be completely concrete. These wild fluctuations in price can even be seen in writing from the times of colonial America, showing how frustrating these problems may have truly been. John Wright, a merchant from this colonial era in Pennsylvania, wrote as much in this quote from his 1761 book, The American Negotiator. Quote, The currencies in the colonies have fluctuated and varied so much that they have differed greatly both as to time and place, seldom being the same in two different provinces at a time, and often changing value in the same place. In some of the provinces they have deviated so much from sterling money in the way of reckoning their monies, and run on to such a degree of depreciation, that 2 shillings sterling hath become equal to £1 nominal currency, or £1 sterling equal to £10. Ultimately, these profound instabilities of tobacco money and bills of credit created a financial void in the colonies that desperately needed to be filled by something stable. Because there were such problems that could cause a colonist's wealth to easily diminish or fluctuate, for example by literally rotting in a warehouse or by evaporating through paper depreciation, there was no way that these forms of money could support long-term economic independence. And since the British pound was really the only stable and globally recognized form of money that was present in the colonies, colonists had no choice but to become more dependent on the steadier money. By failing to produce a durable and reliable medium of exchange, the colonies found themselves in a situation where they were more economically tethered to Britain, as the British pound provided the only credible anchor in an environment where these more local forms of money were risky and volatile. Another tremendous issue with tobacco money, as well as with bills of credit, was that these forms of money, while legitimate in the colonies, struggled to gain legitimacy elsewhere in places such as Britain for numerous reasons. Consequently, this caused the colonial economies to become more dependent on the British economy. Focusing first on tobacco money, many of the struggles for legitimacy as a functional mode of commerce abroad stemmed from the many logistical problems that British traders became skeptical of. Unlike government-regulated bills of credit, tobacco was a decentralized currency grown by individual farmers, which meant regulations were hard to enforce. Production occurred on scattered plantations, and the colonies often lacked administrative reach to ensure every leaf met a baseline standard of value. This lack of regulation thus created two critical vulnerabilities: extreme variance in crop quality and rampant opportunities for fraud without much government intervention. These problems can be clearly seen in this pre-independence era through a 1733 book titled The Case of the Planters of Tobacco in Virginia, written by John Randolph, a colonial lawyer and politician from Virginia. In this book, he characterizes tobacco money as being plagued by certain abuses in the payment, specifically in the practice of running great quantities without paying any duty. This environment, he concludes, was defined by bad managements among themselves, where he then called for better regulations on tobacco in the colonies. Because the colonies could not guarantee a baseline standard for their tobacco currency, British merchants started to become increasingly unwilling to accept tobacco as a legitimate medium for settling economic exchanges. The decentralization of tobacco production made the currency inherently vulnerable to fraud and inconsistency, as documented in 1733 by Randolph. And because of these insecurities, international legitimacy was harder to obtain, as British traders would be less inclined to take such risks. And as tobacco's credibility as an international medium of exchange eroded, many had to resort to using the British pound as it was a legitimate, respected, and centralized coin. Turning now to bills of credit, they also could not establish a strong international sense of legitimacy. Because these bills of credit were very primitive and an early form of paper money, many problems with this reputability arose for British traders. For starters, the ability to fraudulently copy these bills was not only possible, but actually quite common. Since all of these bills had to be handmade, practically every bill of credit differed from another, and there was no proper machinery to make sure that the bills were made in a specific way that prevented forgery. With these two factors together, bills of credit became incredibly easy to forge and very hard to discern between fakes and reals, so much so that inscriptions like "'Tis death to counterfeit" can be found on many of the bills of credit that still survive today. There was also a general sense of confusion and unfamiliarity among British traders, as the bills of credit were purely a colonial currency that could not translate well into a British market. Even colonists from the time noticed this flaw, like John Higginson in his 1720-21 pamphlet titled The Second Part of South Sea Stock, where he acknowledges the value of the bills and how they offered a temporary fix for the lack of British coin, but disagrees in their use for regular commerce after that shortage of coin was alleviated over several years. That much can be seen in this quote from the pamphlet, quote, "But the opening such a door to the making more bills, and continuing for near 30 years, in my opinion, is such a damage." These bills of credit were so confusing and troublesome for British traders who did not fully understand their functionality that it eventually led to them not wanting to trade with them at all. Eventually, as a result of all this confusion, England would begin to pass a series of laws that would prohibit the use and/or creation of new colonial paper monies, with the most aggressive restrictions coming in the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764. By looking at the Currency Act of 1764 in specific, we can see many of the British complaints and frustrations about these bills, like how they found them to be confusing and how it led to discouragement from trading with them. Quote, Such bills of credit have greatly depreciated in their value, by means whereof debts have been discharged with a much less value than what was contracted for, to the great discouragement and prejudice of the trade and commerce of His Majesty's subjects, by occasioning confusion in dealings. Because of the rampant ease of forgery due to lack of standardization, the confusion and mistrust they sparked among British merchants, and the steady depreciation of the value which led to legislative bans, bills of credit failed to establish a foundation of legitimacy in international commerce. And because there was no longer a strong ability to use these bills for trade with Britain, or even a willingness from British traders, period, colonists had no choice but to resort to using British money. Overall, the failure of both tobacco currency and bills of credit to gain legitimacy abroad reveals that these forms of money caused there to be a greater dependence on Britain. Whether through the physical inconsistency and fraud inherent in decentralized tobacco production or the rampant forgery and confusion behind primitive paper bills, these localized systems lacked the translatability required for transatlantic commerce with Britain. These instabilities eroded the confidence of British merchants, as well as providing the British Parliament with the legislative justification to assert control via the Currency Acts. By the colonies' ability to self-regulate their own tender disappearing, these forms of money resulted in the colonial economies becoming more reliant on the British pound. One final resounding challenge that tobacco, money, and bills of credit were troubled by is the problem with its inability for intercolonial use. Tobacco money had many logistical problems that made it incredibly hard to transfer as a money form, and bills of credit were designed in a specific way that prevented the use of them between colonies, which ultimately led to less use of these monetary items and more colonial dependence on the British economy as a result. Beginning with tobacco money, the biggest reason that it was so difficult to be used intercolonially stems from the fact that it was a bulky product that was difficult to move at will. Despite its prevalence in global trade and the fact that it was regularly shipped to faraway markets such as Europe, tobacco's physical bulk made it impractical for routine, small-scale transactions. In other words, its utility as a currency became largely restricted to only high-volume exchanges involving entire warehouse inventories. In colonial times, tobacco was transported and sold by the barrel, specifically a very large type of barrel called the hogshead. This made it incredibly difficult to send your tobacco to nearby markets without the use of water travel, worsened by the fact that loading them onto ships just to be sent somewhere local was expensive. Given these factors, colonists found it most practical to avoid using tobacco in local commerce, opting instead to ship their yields to British markets to extract the most value out of their tobacco. Especially as demand grew and grew, and farmers cultivated more and more, the quantity of tobacco in which they had to move kept increasing, which only exacerbated this difficulty for moving tobacco between local colonial markets. Because tobacco money ceased to be used regularly for small-scale transactions between the colonies, and because most of the tobacco is now being funneled into British markets, tobacco money effectively created a stronger dependence on the British economy. It created a void in which the British pound was ready to fill, while also handing Britain an immense amount of control over the colonial flow of tobacco. Transitioning now to bills of credit, they also could not facilitate intercolonial trade. This is because bills of credit were made independently by every colony that produced them, leading to wide value differences in bills of credit from colony to colony. Each colony ran its own independent monetary policy and often had such a degree of autonomy that some monetary historians, like Bruce D. Smith in his article titled American Colonial Monetary Regimes, note that referring to these colonies as countries wouldn't be far-fetched because of the way they functioned. Because these colonies printed distinct bills backed by their own economies, the purchasing power of their paper money often diverged sharply from one territory to the next, as not one colonial economy was exactly like the other. This meant crossing borders into different territories meant all your bills had a very real chance of either losing or gaining purchasing power. And on top of this, some colonies flat out did not accept bills from other colonies. A fantastic quote from Mark Ziak's article simply titled Currency Act explains this particularly well, where it outlines how money could differ greatly in value or be worth nothing at all if you cross colonial borders. Quote, currency systems were not standardized between the colonies, meaning that one colony's money might be worth different amounts or nothing at all in a neighboring colony, playing havoc on intercolonial trade. Because of the limited reach of colonial paper money, which was even sometimes done by design, the British pound was able to prevail as the standard for intercolonial commerce. Since merchants required a reliable tender for trade between provinces, they turned to the pound because bills of credit could not provide such reliability, which was a move that integrated the colonial economy more deeply with Britain. In essence, the logistical burden of tobacco and the localized fragmentation of bills of credit created a monetary vacuum in the colonies that only British currency could effectively fill. Tobacco's sheer bulk relegated it to only high-volume exports, and bills of credit remained constrained by inconsistent values across colonial borders, and neither could provide the fluidity required for a cohesive domestic market. This inability to facilitate trade between their own colonial neighbors meant that British pound became the glue for intercolonial commerce, and by failing to establish a functional colonial currency, the colonies anchored their economic survival more to the British crown and prevented themselves from achieving economic independence until the Revolution. To conclude, the popular historical narrative of an early, energetic spirit of American autonomy is significantly undermined by the realities of the economic state of pre independence colonies. While tobacco commodity money and bills of credit were born out of a desperate need to fix the chronic shortage of British coin, they fundamentally failed to provide a sovereign financial system. Instead, these currencies acted as a catalyst for deeper imperial reliance through three primary failings: the inherent volatility of tobacco that is prone to rotting, and the paper notes vulnerable to depreciation left the colonies without a stable store of value, making long-term wealth and economic independence unachievable. Additionally, the inability of these primitive systems to garner international legitimacy, compounded by rampant forgery in the subsequent British Currency Acts, rendered colonial tender suspect in the eyes of global markets and prevented them from ever gaining reputability. Finally, the logistical burdens of transporting bulky tobacco combined with the inability of bills of credit to be used between provinces prevented the creation of a unified intercolonial trade network, making the need for British money more striking. Rather than fostering independence, tobacco commodity money and bills of credit forced the 13 colonies into a tighter orbit around the British economy by cementing the British pound as the only credible currency through many problems. As both forms of tender suffer from chronic price instability and loss of value, the two of them consistently suffered from a lack of public and professional trust, and they both lacked the intercolonial abilities required to facilitate commerce across borders.